Edward Barrington stepped down from the carriage onto the wet cobblestones of London, the early evening fog curling around his boots. It was late November of 1898, and gas lamps along the street flickered to life against the encroaching dusk. After months away on military service at the Empire's frontiers, Edward's heart quickened at the thought of finally returning home. He pulled his greatcoat tighter against the chill, anticipation and longing warming him from within as he approached the front steps of his townhouse. At the door of the elegant brick residence in Mayfair, a footman bowed and moved aside. Edward handed off his travel coat and hat. "Is Lady Catherine in?" he asked, unable to keep the eagerness from his voice. "Yes, sir," the footman replied. "Her ladyship is in the drawing room." Edward took a calming breath as he strode down the familiar corridor. He had dreamed of this moment on many lonely nights abroad, the moment he would see his wife Catherine again. He imagined her radiant smile, the warmth of her embrace. 11 months. That was how long it had been since he'd last seen her. Letters had crossed oceans between them, but ink on paper could not substitute for her presence. The war in the Sudan had demanded his duty, but now duty was fulfilled, and he was home. Pushing open the polished mahogany door to the drawing room, Edward paused on the threshold. Catherine stood by the fireplace, illuminated by the soft glow of flames. She wore a lavender silk afternoon dress trimmed with white lace, her dark hair pinned up in an elegant chignon. The sight of her stole his breath. She was as beautiful as he remembered, perhaps even more so. "Edward!" Catherine exclaimed, turning at the sound of the door. Her blue eyes widened in surprise. Clearly she had not expected him until a later train, or perhaps a letter to announce his arrival had outpaced him. He crossed the room in a few long strides. "My dear Catherine," he said softly, arms already opening to enfold her. He gently pulled her into an embrace. For a fleeting second, she stiffened against him. So slight that had he not known her so well, he might not have noticed. Then her arms came around him in return, and she pressed her cheek against his shoulder. "You're home," Catherine murmured. Her words were warm enough, but Edward sensed something restrained in her tone. He drew back just enough to look at her face. She smiled, yet it did not reach her eyes, which glistened as if with unshed tears or perhaps fear? It made no sense. Surely these were tears of joy at their reunion. "Yes, I'm home for good now." Edward brushed a gloved hand tenderly along her cheek. She felt cool to his touch. "I have dreamed of this moment every day we were apart." Catherine lowered her gaze. "As have I," she replied politely. Her hands slipped from around his back, and she stepped from his embrace. "You must be exhausted from your journey. Shall I ring for tea? Or perhaps you would prefer a brandy after your travels?" Edward smiled, hoping to put her at ease. "Tea would be lovely, but only if you sit with me while I have it. I want to hear everything. How you've been, what has happened here in London, every little detail I missed." He noticed her hesitate a fraction of a second before she forced a brighter smile and went to pull the bell cord for service. "Of course. There is much to tell, though life here was nowhere near as exciting as what you've been through, I'm sure." While they waited for tea, Edward settled into his favorite armchair near the fire. Catherine sat opposite him on a settee. He studied her surreptitiously in the firelight. She was as graceful as ever, but there was a tension about her now. A certain pallor to her complexion and a tightness at the corners of her mouth that had not been there before. Perhaps she had worried terribly for his safety while he was gone. That could explain it. Or perhaps the long separation simply left an awkwardness between them that time would heal. After all, nearly a year apart was a strain on any marriage. He resolved to be patient and gentle. She had, in her letters, hinted at loneliness and the burdens of managing the household alone. A maid entered with a tray bearing the teapot and cups. As Catherine busied herself pouring, Edward tried again to draw her out. "How is your father faring? And your brother Thomas, did he end up going to Oxford as planned?" Catherine's family was of good name, though moderate fortune. Her father a baronet in Kent. Edward remembered she visited them for a month in the summer while he was away. Catherine passed him a china cup but did not meet his eyes. Father has been in fine health. And yes, Thomas went up to Oxford in Michaelmas term. He often inquired after you in his letters to me. We are all so relieved you're safe. Edward heard the tremor in her voice when she mentioned relief at his safety. Surely she was simply overwhelmed by emotion right now. He reached across the small table to place his hand over hers. It must have been difficult for you, my love, with me so far away. I am sorry I was gone so long, but I'm home now. No more frontiers or campaigns for a good long while. She finally raised her eyes to his. For an instant, Edward glimpsed profound sorrow in her expression, as if she might break into tears. But she blinked and looked away, composing herself. I am glad, was all Catherine said softly. They sipped tea in silence for a moment. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant clatter of hooves on the street outside. Edward felt a creeping unease at his wife's manner. This reunion was not at all as he had envisioned. Catherine seemed almost like a polite stranger rather than a loving wife rejoicing in her husband's return. Where was her laughter? Her delight? The letters she sent him had been affectionate and full of longing. Now, in person, she was reserved and anxious. He offered her a plate of butter biscuits from the tray, hoping to lighten the mood. You've taken good care of the house, he said. Everything looks in order. I trust the servants served you well in my absence? Yes, they have been very attentive. Catherine took a biscuit, but only nibbled it. Her appetite seemed scant. Mrs. Thompson next door helped me occasionally with managing the household accounts. And Lord Henry... She trailed off, color rising to her cheeks. Edward raised an eyebrow. Lord Henry? Lord Henry Pembroke, Catherine clarified quickly, her tone too casual. He was kind enough to assist with a few matters regarding the estate. Some tenants needed addressing, and I did not wish to bother you so far away. Henry offered his help. At the mention of Henry Pembroke's name, Edward felt a twinge of surprise. Henry was not only their neighbor, but one of Edward's oldest friends. In fact, Henry had served alongside Edward years ago and had left the army for a life of leisure after inheriting his late uncle's title and fortune. Edward had always trusted Henry implicitly. He was practically family. That was very good of him, Edward said slowly. I shall have to thank Henry when I see him. I knew I could rely on him to look out for you in my absence. Catherine's face was turned aside, but Edward thought he saw her eyes close briefly as if in pain. She set down her teacup with a faint clink. There's no need to make a fuss. He was simply being a friend. Her voice was tight. Before Edward could inquire further, the butler appeared at the doorway. Sir, your trunks have been brought in. Shall I have them taken up to your dressing room? Yes, thank you, Hawkins, Edward answered. As the butler departed, Edward rose and offered his hand to Catherine. Shall we go upstairs? I'm sure I'm a sight after traveling. I'd like to freshen up. And I confess, I'd be very grateful if you'd sit with me while I unpack. I've brought a few gifts from abroad I've been keen to give you. Catherine managed a small smile and placed her hand in his. Of course. Leading her up the grand staircase, Edward felt some of his earlier disappointment ease. Perhaps privacy would help Catherine relax. It occurred to him that she might feel shy or uncertain with him after so long apart, especially if she had heard rumors of hardships or dangers he faced. Sometimes, wives almost feared their husbands coming back changed or severe from war. He would show her he was the same man who loved her deeply. In the master bedroom, a low fire had been lit to ward off the autumn damp. Edward's trunks stood at the foot of the bed. He opened the first, rummaging under his neatly folded uniforms and shirts, until he found what he sought. A long, rectangular box wrapped in tissue. I got this in Cairo, he said, bringing the box to Catherine, who hovered near the hearth. Open it. She looked at him in surprise, and then carefully removed the paper. Inside lay a delicate necklace, fine gold filigree with a pendant of lapis lazuli carved in the shape of a lotus flower. In the firelight, the deep blue stone glimmered. "It's lovely," Catherine said softly, lifting the necklace. "The lotus. It's beautiful." Edward stepped behind her. "May I?" he asked, taking the necklace. She nodded and turned slightly, allowing him to drape it around her neck and fasten the clasp. His fingers brushed the nape of her neck, and he hoped she might lean back into his touch. But she stood rigid, arms crossed lightly over her waist. "It suits you," Edward said, trying not to show the hurt he felt at her continued distance. In the mirror above the mantel, he saw her fingertips touch the pendant, but her expression remained troubled. "You're too generous," she replied. "Thank you, Edward. I shall treasure it." Yet her voice lacked the delight he had expected. A heavy silence settled between them. Edward, desperate to reconnect with his wife, closed the distance and gently turned her to face him. "Catherine, have I done something to upset you? You seem unhappy since I arrived." Catherine's eyes widened, a flash of alarm crossing her face. "No! No, of course not. Forgive me, I am just tired, I suppose. The shock and excitement." She took a step back, her skirts brushing his legs. "Perhaps I should retire early tonight. You must be tired as well after your journey." Edward felt as if she had slapped him, though she had spoken kindly enough. Retire early? On the very night of his return? He had assumed they would spend the evening catching up, perhaps even sharing the same bed for the first time in nearly a year. He flushed at his own eagerness. Perhaps she wasn't ready, but her wanting to withdraw so soon stung. "If that is what you wish," he managed to say evenly. "I am a bit fatigued, yes." It was not true. He was running on the adrenaline of homecoming, but he would not force her into intimacy if she was unwell or uneasy. Catherine offered a wan smile. "A good night's rest will do us both good. Tomorrow, things will feel more normal, I'm sure." She moved towards the door. "I'll have Mary prepare the blue room for you, since we haven't had time to warm this room properly for you." Edward's throat tightened. It was tradition in some circles for a returning husband to spend his first night or two in a separate room to readjust, but he had so looked forward to holding his wife close tonight. That she anticipated he sleep elsewhere confirmed how distant she felt. But he forced himself to nod. "Very well, as you think best." She paused at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, not meeting his gaze. "I am truly happy you are home safe, Edward. Good night." The words were correct, but her tone sounded almost like a plea. "Good night, Catherine," he replied softly. After she left, Edward remained standing in the half-unpacked bedroom, the sense of warmth and joy that had buoyed him now ebbing away into confusion. Catherine's behavior was not at all what he had expected. He felt as though he had embraced a ghost. Her form was there, familiar and beloved, but her spirit seemed elsewhere. He removed his jacket and sat on the edge of the bed, turning over the evening in his mind. Could it be that she was ailing in some way? Perhaps a nervous condition from stress? She had looked as if she hadn't been sleeping. Faint shadows under her eyes, and that forced composure. If she was ill or depressed, she might not want to burden him with it immediately on his return. Yes, that could be it. Edward seized on the thought. It was far more palatable than any alternative his darker imagination offered. The notion that Catherine might not love him as before was too painful to consider without evidence. He determined that on the morrow he would speak with her gently, maybe suggest a short trip to the countryside for her health if she was fatigued by London, or encourage her to confide in him if anything was troubling her. They had been so close once. Hers was the shoulder he leaned on for comfort, just as he was hers. Time and patience would surely mend this unsettling rift. Edward rose and closed the door. In the quiet, he could hear Catherine's faint voice in the hall, giving instructions to Mary, the lady's maid, to prepare the guest room for him. The very formality of it made his heart ache. He changed out of his travel-worn suit into a dressing gown. When Mary came to inform him that the blue room was ready, he forced a polite smile and thanks. It wouldn't do to let the servants sense anything amiss. Alone in the guest chamber that night, Edward barely slept. The comfortable bed and familiar sounds of the city could not soothe the turmoil in his mind. Catherine's distant eyes haunted him. He replayed every small interaction, searching for clues. He had left an affectionate wife full of playful wit and warmth. He returned to a woman who behaved like a courteous stranger. Perhaps, he thought with a pang, perhaps I have changed as well. War changes a man, they say. Did I come home a stranger without realizing it? I must show her I am still the man she married. With that resolution, sometime in the deep of night, Edward drifted into a restless sleep, unaware that the mystery behind Catherine's coolness was far more complicated and far more devastating than mere time apart. Chapter 2. The Shadows of Doubt. In the days that followed Edward's return, London was awash in winter's gray chill. December settled on the city with a constant drizzle of rain, clattering on the window panes of the Barrington home. Inside, the household resumed an outward semblance of normalcy. Edward rose each morning and took breakfast with Catherine in the dining room. They discussed the news, Parliament's latest debates, the Queen's upcoming Jubilee events, small trifles about which acquaintances had returned to town for the season. Catherine fulfilled her duties as a lady of the house, directing the cook and housemaids, attending church on Sundays, and paying short calls on a few friends in the afternoons. To any casual observer, Sir Edward Barrington and Lady Catherine were a perfectly decorous Victorian couple settling back into life together. Yet beneath the polite surface, Edward felt a gulf widening. Each time he attempted to draw closer to Catherine, she held him at arm's length with gentle evasions. When he proposed a stroll in Hyde Park as they used to enjoy, she pleaded a headache. If he suggested an evening at the theater, she insisted she was too tired. At night, she continued to insist he sleep in the guest room. Until you've fully recovered from your trip, dear. After a week, Edward finally broached the subject of resuming their shared bedroom, only for Catherine to falter and say she had developed a persistent cough and did not wish to disturb his sleep. Edward was not entirely a naïve man. He realized these excuses, stacked one upon another, began to form a pattern. A sick feeling started to coil in his stomach. Something was amiss. Something more than the expected shyness of a long separation. Catherine was avoiding intimacy, even avoiding simple closeness, with a determination that frightened him. During the second week of his homecoming, Edward found himself in his study late one evening, poring over household account books that Catherine had managed in his absence. The gaslight hissed softly above, illuminating neat columns of expenditures. Everything appeared to be in order. Catherine was capable and responsible with finances. But as Edward flipped through the pages, he noticed certain entries with curiosity. There were more charges than usual for the stables and carriage use, for instance. It seemed Catherine had been out driving frequently, trips to Richmond, to Hampstead Heath, even as far as Windsor. These outings were far beyond her normal routine, which usually consisted of nearby calls or errands. The dates caught his eye as well. Many of these excursions took place in the spring and summer while he was away, often on weekday afternoons. He tapped the ledger thoughtfully with his finger. Catherine had never mentioned any lengthy drives in her letters. Of course, she wasn't obliged to detail her every activity, but still, it struck him as unusual. Perhaps she had taken up visiting relatives or distant friends to distract herself from loneliness? Edward decided it was worth asking her casually. He closed the account book and went in search of Catherine. He found her in the small parlor, curled on a sofa with an embroidery hoop in hand, though her needle had paused mid-stitch and she gazed into the middle distance, seemingly lost in thought. She startled when Edward spoke. "Penny for your thoughts," he said lightly, coming to stand near her. Catherine gave a half smile and resumed stitching a rose onto the handkerchief in her lap. "Oh, nothing of note. I was just wool gathering." He sat down beside her, noting how she subtly shifted a few inches away. "I was looking over the accounts. I noticed you took several carriage rides out of town earlier this year." I hope you at least enjoyed some fine weather during those trips? Her hand stilled again. She did not look up from the embroidery. Yes, I did go out a few times. The city was stifling in summer and the countryside air did me good. Her tone was measured, carefully neutral. Did you visit anyone in particular? Edward probed gently. Richmond and Windsor are quite far for a day trip. Catherine set her embroidery aside, rising to her feet in a restless motion. Must we talk about dull things like accounts and outings? I'd rather hear about your adventures up the Nile or in Khartoum. She crossed to the fireplace, placing a delicate hand on the mantel as if to steady herself. Her face was turned away from him. Edward watched her, unease growing. She was deflecting his question. Very well, he said slowly, standing as well. Though I assure you my tales of military camp life are far duller than a summer picnic by the Thames. He moved behind her and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. She tensed as if bracing for a blow. Edward's heart sank at that involuntary reaction. He withdrew his hands, trying not to show hurt. Catherine, he said quietly, you know you can speak to me about anything, don't you? If something is troubling you. At that, she turned around, face pale and eyes bright. Nothing is troubling me. The force of her reply startled them both. She bit her lip, then continued in a more subdued tone. Forgive me. I am just out of sorts lately. It is difficult to adjust, as you said. But please, do not worry on my account. Before he could answer, the clock on the mantel chimed 9 o'clock. Catherine seized on it. Oh, I nearly forgot. I promised Mrs. Thompson I would review the plans for the church charity bazaar with her tonight. She'll be expecting me. She glanced toward the door anxiously. Tonight? At this hour? Edward frowned. He couldn't recall any mention of a bazaar meeting in her schedule. Yes, she specifically asked for my help. Catherine was already moving toward the doorway. I shouldn't be long. Don't wait up, dear. She paused only to grab her cloak from the hall stand. Edward followed into the foyer, deeply unsettled. It's raining steadily, he said. Allow me to accompany you with an umbrella at least. No! Catherine's voice came out in an urgent cry. Then she softened it. I mean, there's no need. Thompson's carriage is coming to fetch me. I'll be perfectly fine. She gave a ghost of a reassuring smile and pecked his cheek quickly. It was one of the few kisses she had given since his return, and it was gone as swiftly as it landed. Before Edward could protest further, Catherine slipped out the front door and into the rainy night. He stood in the open doorway for a moment, watching as indeed a carriage awaited at the curb. Through the mist, he could just make out the crest on its side. It did appear to be the Thompsons' family seal. Catherine was assisted inside by a shadowy figure, perhaps Mrs. Thompson's footman, and the coach drove off. Edward closed the door, a hollow feeling in his chest. There was no particular reason to doubt her explanation. Mrs. Thompson was a respectable neighbor and friend. Yet something in Catherine's manner had rung false. Why had she been so nervous and urgent? A meeting about a charity bazaar at 9 o'clock on a rainy night seemed oddly timed. He reminded himself that perhaps the timing was simply when the older Mrs. Thompson was free and they lived only a few streets away. But Catherine's palpable relief to escape the conversation just now lingered in Edward's mind. She had practically fled. With a troubled sigh, he retreated to his study once more. Work might distract him. He attempted to review some correspondence. The Army had sent a letter asking if he would consider a posting training new cadets at Sandhurst next spring, a comfortable assignment that would keep him mostly in England. It was an honor, and something he normally would have been eager to discuss with Catherine for her input. Now he hesitated. Could he even think of leaving home again for any stretch of time when his marriage felt so uncertain? An hour passed, and Edward realized he'd read the same paragraph in the letter 4 times without absorbing it. His mind remained fixed on his wife. Eventually, he gave up on paperwork and instead poured himself a small glass of brandy from the decanter. He sat in the dim study, swirling the amber liquid and replaying every odd moment since his homecoming. Where had his joyful, affectionate wife gone? This Catherine was a bundle of nerves and secrets. Edward could not imagine what could make her so. Financial troubles? No, the accounts were fine. Illness? She showed no physical symptoms beyond fatigue and that mysterious cough that conveniently kept them apart at night. Grief or worry? Possibly, but about what? He had returned safely. If anything serious had happened in her life during his absence, surely she would have confided it in her letters or upon his return. The only other thought that crept in was one he tried to banish immediately. The possibility that Catherine harbored resentment toward him for leaving, or worse, that her feelings for him had cooled and transferred to some other source of comfort. He hated himself for even considering that she might have found solace in another man's company. Catherine was a loyal and moral woman. She would never break their marriage vows. But then he thought of the way she had flinched from his touch. The way she avoided meeting his eyes when mentioning Henry's name. Henry. No, he dismissed it. Henry Pembroke had been his friend since they were young lieutenants. Henry had introduced Edward to Catherine at a garden party years ago. He was practically responsible for their match. In his letters, Henry had often mentioned keeping an eye on Catherine for him, reassuring Edward that all was well at home. Henry was honorable, wasn't he? The brandy burned slightly as Edward swallowed it down. War and distance can play tricks on a man's mind, he admonished himself. He must not jump at shadows. It was entirely likely Catherine just needed more time and gentle attention to feel comfortable again. He resolved to be more proactive. Perhaps he had given her too much space out of consideration and inadvertently made her feel he was distant. Tomorrow, he would take a firmer hand in rekindling their closeness. Maybe he would surprise her with tickets to a concert or arrange a small dinner with dear friends to help her ease back into society with him by her side. A clap of thunder rumbled outside, drawing Edward's thoughts to the present. He glanced at the clock, nearly 10:30. Catherine had not yet returned. The charity meeting should not take terribly long, especially at this hour. Worried now, Edward fetched his coat and umbrella, deciding he would walk over to the Thompsons to escort Catherine home. He could not rest while she was out in a storm. No sooner had he donned his coat, however, than he heard the rattle of the front door latch. Catherine stepped in, droplets clinging to her cloak and the brim of her velvet hat. Her cheeks were flushed as she nearly bumped into Edward in the foyer. Clearly surprised at finding him waiting, she drew back with wide eyes. "Edward, what are you doing up?" Edward took the umbrella from her trembling hand and set it aside. "I was about to come make sure you got home safely," he said, trying to keep his tone mild. "It's a foul night and getting late." Catherine forced a light laugh that did not ring true. "You worry too much. I was perfectly fine. See, Mrs. Thompson's carriage delivered me to the door." She began removing her spotted cloak. Edward helped ease it off her shoulders. The garment was damp and cool. Beneath it, Catherine's body radiated warmth. Perhaps the carriage had been well heated, or she was flushed from something else. His mind darted suspiciously, imagining her rushing back. He caught the faintest scent on her clothes. Cigar smoke? It was not unusual. Many gentlemen smoked in company, and Mrs. Thompson's husband might have indulged if he was present. Yet the smell unsettled him. Neither Catherine nor the elderly Mrs. Thompson would have touched a cigar. "I trust your meeting was productive?" he asked, watching her closely as he hung her cloak on the rack. She smoothed her hair, avoiding his gaze. "Yes, very productive. We have a solid plan for the charity bazaar next month." Edward stepped nearer, tipping her chin gently up with his finger so she had to look at him. "Catherine, are you sure that's where you truly were?" The question escaped before he could restrain it. His voice was soft, but the implication hung in the air between them. Catherine's eyes went wide with what looked like panic. "How can you ask me that?" she whispered. Her face blanched, and she pulled away from his touch. "Of course I was at the Thompsons. How could you think otherwise? Edward instantly felt guilty. What proof had he, after all, of any deception? Forgive me, he said hastily. I did not mean to imply. It's only that you've seemed so unhappy and secretive. I scarcely know what to think these days. Tears sprang to Catherine's eyes, shining in the lamplight. She turned her back to him, one hand pressed to her mouth. Please, Edward, she said, voice breaking. Please, just go to bed. I beg you. I cannot do this tonight. Her shoulders shook as if she were holding in sobs. Edward was stricken. He longed to comfort her, but an invisible wall seemed to surround his wife. He felt if he tried to embrace her now, she might shatter. As you wish, he murmured. We can speak tomorrow. Good night, Catherine. She did not respond, standing motionless as he quietly retreated upstairs, heart heavy and mind churning with unanswered questions. That night he slept even less than the one before. Something was deeply wrong, and for all his attempts to deny it, Edward could no longer ignore the gnawing possibility that Catherine might indeed be hiding a terrible secret. Chapter 3. The letter 2 days later, Edward visited his gentleman's club on Pall Mall in an attempt to find some respite from the tense atmosphere at home. The Army and Navy Club's high-ceilinged dining hall offered companionship and comfort in routine. As he lunched on cold beef and potatoes, a few fellow officers welcomed him back to London with hearty handshakes and lively talk of regimental news. Yet even here, Edward could not escape reminders of Henry and Catherine. Major Ellis, a convivial older officer with a walrus mustache, clapped Edward on the shoulder. Glad to have you back, Barrington. We were just saying how splendidly your wife carried on while you were away. An admirable woman, Lady Catherine. Edward managed a polite smile. She is indeed. Oh, yes, Major Ellis went on cheerfully, slicing his beef. She and Lord Pembroke were quite the pair about town this summer. Don't misunderstand, he added quickly, seeing Edward's fork pause midair. Old Henry was simply being the good friend he is. Kept her spirits up, I dare say. I saw them together at the Royal Academy exhibition, and at Ascot as well. People remarked on what a loyal friend you had, watching over your dear lady. The Major chuckled innocently. Nary a week went by without Henry escorting Lady Catherine here or there, making sure she wasn't lonely. Jolly good of him, what? Edward felt a leaden weight in his stomach. He forced himself to breathe evenly and not grip his knife too tightly. Quite, he managed, voice neutral. Very loyal indeed. Another officer chimed in amiably. Pembroke's a true gentleman. Not many would take on the trouble of caring for a friend's household so diligently. Edward excused himself soon after, claiming he had an errand to run. Outside in the cold drizzle, he walked briskly, heedless of the damp seeping through his hat. Major Ellis's words rang in his ears. Nary a week went by without Henry escorting Lady Catherine. What might appear to others as friendly duty now, to Edward looked like something far more intimate. Henry's unusual absence since Edward's return suddenly made sense in the worst way. Henry had not called in person, only sending a note of welcome with regrets for being busy in the country. In retrospect, it seemed a feeble excuse. No doubt Henry lacked the courage to face the man he had deceived. By the time Edward turned onto his street, his mind was awhirl with betrayal and pain. He still wanted to deny it, to find some innocent explanation, but it was becoming impossible. He needed proof, something concrete beyond gossip and instinct. If, God forbid, his wife and his closest friend had truly betrayed him, he had to know for certain. The townhouse was quiet when he entered. Hawkins, the butler, informed him that Lady Catherine had gone to take tea with a neighbor, Mrs. Fairfax, and would return within the hour. Edward thanked him and removed his wet coat. He headed to the library, a small, cozy room lined with books that Catherine often used as a private sitting room. There, Edward sank into the leather armchair, trying to calm the storm inside him. His eyes roamed the familiar shelves. How many evenings had he spent here reading by the fire, while Catherine embroidered nearby? His gaze landed on a slim volume of poetry on the side table, Alfred Lord Tennyson's collected poems. Catherine's favorite. Perhaps a bit of poetry would soothe his spirit as it used to. He picked up the book. As he opened the cover, a folded paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Edward frowned and stooped to retrieve it, thinking it was a bookmark or a note. The paper was thick, expensive stationery, folded twice. There was no address or seal, perhaps a personal letter someone had tucked away. Without conscious intent, Edward unfolded the paper. In an instant, his heart lurched violently in his chest. The handwriting was unmistakably Henry's bold script. He recognized it from countless notes and letters over years of friendship. The blood pounded in Edward's ears as he read the first lines. "My dearest Catherine, your letter brightened my day more than I can say. How I cherish every stolen moment with you. Last Tuesday in Kensington Gardens, seeing you even briefly, holding your hand beneath the trees, sustains me for now. But I long for more. I dream of you constantly. The time until our next meeting feels like an eternity. You ask if what we are doing is terribly wrong. Perhaps in the eyes of the world it is, but in the eyes of my heart, it is the only true and right thing. I love you. I have loved you from the moment I first laid eyes on you years ago. That feeling only grew once you became Edward's wife, and I was forced to hide it. Forgive me, but I cannot pretend any longer. If fate were kinder, you would have been mine." Edward could barely see the words through the red haze filling his vision. His hands trembled so violently the paper shook. He clenched his jaw and forced himself to continue reading, each sentence a dagger. "Your last letter gives me hope that you might feel the same. You spoke of unhappiness and loneliness. Oh, Catherine, if only I could take you away from all this. If only Edward hadn't returned so soon." A strangled sound escaped Edward's throat, half sob, half growl. He pressed a fist to his mouth as though physical pain might contain the agony tearing through him. "I will be at our cottage near Richmond on Friday next, as we agreed. Say you will come to me, even if only for an hour. I live for that promise. Until then, all my love is yours. Forever, Henry." The letter slipped from Edward's fingers. For a long moment he could not think or move. His worst nightmare was spelled out in those lines. Not an idle flirtation, not a misunderstanding. Love. Passionate, treasonous love from his friend to his wife, reciprocated by her if the letter's content was to be believed. Edward slowly sank to his knees on the carpet, feeling as though the very ground had given way beneath him. His chest heaved with each breath that felt sharp as knives. How could this be real? Catherine, his Catherine, and Henry, carrying on an affair under his very nose while he bled and fought under a foreign sun for queen and country. A surge of fury coursed through him so suddenly he scarcely knew what he was doing. He seized the fallen letter, and in a flash of rage hurled the entire Tennyson volume across the room. It struck a shelf, knocking over a framed photograph of their wedding day. The glass cracked, fissuring the captured image of Edward in his dress uniform beside a radiant, innocent-looking Catherine in white. How bitterly ironic that image seemed now. The crash brought Edward to his senses. He stood, chest heaving, and ran a hand through his hair. He mustn't lose control. Any servant might hear. Scandal. The word alone cut through his fury with cold clarity. If this affair became public, it would ruin them all. He would become a pitied cuckold, his wife a social pariah, Henry a scoundrel shunned by polite society. Everything he had built, his career, his honor, the family name, would be tarnished. At that thought, a grim resolve formed within Edward. However great his personal pain, he would not allow their betrayal to explode into public view. This matter must be handled with the utmost discretion, as befitting an officer and a gentleman. But handled it would be. Edward retrieved the letter, smoothing its creases with trembling hands. He folded it and slipped it into the inner pocket of his waistcoat, close to his heart that felt as if it had been ripped open. Evidence. He would keep this vile missive to remind him that this was no feverish imagining. It was real. Upstairs, a door closed. Catherine must have returned from her outing. Edward's entire body tensed. He could not, would not face her now, not with the tempest raging in his soul. If he saw her, he feared he might either collapse in anguish at her feet or shake her in wrath and demand answers that he was not ready to hear from her lips. No, not yet. First, he needed to think. He needed a plan. Edward swiftly left the library, quietly taking his coat and hat from the stand by the door. He slipped out of the house just as Catherine's voice floated down the staircase calling for him. He could not bear to reply. Let her wonder where he'd gone. Rain had begun to fall again, matching the bleakness of his heart. Edward walked aimlessly for a time, the brim of his hat slanting rivulets of water away from his face. He wandered past familiar squares and shops without seeing them. His mind churned over a single question. What now? By the time twilight fell, Edward found himself in Green Park, not far from Buckingham Palace. Under an ancient oak, sheltered somewhat from the drizzle, he finally stopped and allowed himself to think of the unthinkable. Catherine and Henry had betrayed him. The woman he adored and the friend he trusted above all others had made a mockery of his love and friendship. A hot lump rose in Edward's throat. He could not decide which hurt more, the pain of Catherine's faithlessness or the sting of Henry's perfidy. They were entwined, fueling his sense of utter humiliation. He thought of every embrace he had given Catherine since returning, met with cool reluctance. No wonder if her passion had been given to another. He thought of Henry's letters to him abroad, assuring that all was well. What a devil, smiling to his face while coveting his wife behind his back. Anger flared again, white-hot and consuming. Edward's fists clenched in his coat pockets. He would have satisfaction for this, one way or another. But how? Dueling was outlawed, and more to the point, it risked creating the scandal he was desperate to avoid. Dragging this affair into the open with a public confrontation would ruin his name nearly as much as the adultery itself, once the gossips had their say. He paced under the tree, boots squelching in the wet grass. The law offered little comfort either. He could pursue a divorce through the courts, citing adultery. It was one remedy society grudgingly allowed an injured husband. Yet that too would mean public spectacle, airing sordid details in the newspapers for prying eyes. The scandal would attach to his name permanently, and Catherine's life would be destroyed. Despite everything, a part of him balked at utterly destroying the woman he had loved so dearly, no matter how cruelly she had wounded him. No, divorce or lawsuits would not do. They were weapons wielded by men unconcerned with the niceties of honor or the aftermath of infamy. Edward was a gentleman, and he would handle this as a gentleman should, privately, decisively, and with as little collateral damage as possible. That left one grim option, one which had been banished from polite society's playbook, but which still lived in the unspoken code of men like Edward: a duel. The thought of standing 20 paces from Henry at dawn, pistol in hand, flashed in Edward's mind with startling clarity. It was an archaic, illegal practice. The army forbade it, the law condemned it as murder. And yet, among the circles of officers and nobles, it remained the final recourse when honor was trespassed beyond all civil redress. Henry would understand. Henry, who had served and knew the code of honor, would not refuse such a challenge if he had a shred of integrity left. He owed Edward that much. Edward exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the chill evening air. Yes, he would challenge Henry Pembroke to a duel, man to man. The affair would end where it began, in secrecy. One way or another, Edward's honor would be satisfied. Either he would kill the bastard or, at the very least, scar him and banish him from their lives forever. Perhaps he might die in the attempt, but in truth, a life shattered by betrayal did not seem worth living anyway. Better to risk death with honor than live in shame. A distant clock tower struck 6. Dusk had deepened, and the rain was tapering off. Edward's resolve solidified. He would need a second, someone trustworthy to help arrange the details and keep silent. Colonel Collins, an old family friend and fellow officer, came to mind. Collins was a traditionalist and would likely understand without judgment. Edward decided to call on him at first light. As for Catherine, he would not speak to her of this. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The duel would settle the matter of Henry. What to do with Catherine afterward was another question entirely, one he pushed aside for the moment. First, he had to get through what lay ahead. Straightening his soaked coat, Edward left the refuge of the oak and walked with purpose out of the park. He headed home in the darkness, ready to face his wife with a facade of calm civility. The die was cast in his mind, but until the appointed hour, he would play the part of the oblivious husband a little longer. When he stepped into the foyer of his house at last, Catherine came rushing towards him, worry etched on her face. "Edward, where have you been? I was so worried." Her eyes were red as if she had been crying. She reached as though to touch his arm, then stopped herself. Edward summoned a tight, polite smile. The sight of her, the scent of her rosewater perfume, was almost enough to break his composure, but he steeled himself. He gently removed his hat and handed it to Hawkins, who had appeared silently to take it. "Just out for a walk to clear my head," Edward said evenly. "I'm sorry if I alarmed you." Catherine searched his face. "You vanished so suddenly. I thought something might have happened." "I assure you I am quite well." He avoided her gaze under the pretense of removing his damp gloves. "We can talk later. I fear I am rather tired this evening." He saw her flinch at his cool tone. She opened her mouth as if to speak, perhaps to finally confess everything right then and there. He saw the torment in her eyes. But in the end, Catherine merely nodded. "Of course, I'll have Mrs. Jensen send up a tray for your supper, if you prefer to eat in your room." "Thank you," Edward replied quietly. "That would be best." He left her standing in the hall, her slender frame seeming smaller than ever, wrapped in guilt and sorrow. A distant part of him longed to take her in his arms and weep out his hurt, to hear her explanation or apology or whatever she could offer. But that part was silenced by the icy resolve that had taken hold of him. There would be no emotional scenes, no dramatic accusations, only the appointed retribution at dawn's first light, soon to come. Chapter 4. The Challenge. Dawn's first pale light found Edward already dressed and pacing the length of his study. He had not truly slept. What rest he managed came in fitful snatches, interrupted by flashes of anger and anguish. Now the morning of reckoning had come. Without waking Catherine or any servants, Edward slipped out of the house just after sunrise. The air was bitterly cold, a knife-edged wind stirring in the street. He set off for the home of Colonel Nathaniel Collins, an old family friend and fellow army officer long retired. Collins was known for his discretion and adherence to the old codes of conduct. If anyone would understand what he meant to do, it was the colonel. By 7 o'clock, Edward stood at Collins's doorstep in St. James's Square, rapping the knocker firmly. A sleepy maid answered, but upon recognizing Sir Edward, she quickly showed him into the colonel's book-lined study, offering to wake her master at once. Within minutes, Colonel Collins appeared, hastily dressed in a smoking jacket over his shirt and trousers, gray hair still tousled from sleep. "Edward, my boy," he greeted, concern etched on his lined face. "What on earth brings you here at this hour? Has something happened?" Edward swallowed, suddenly aware of the dryness in his throat. He removed his gloves, which were still damp from the misty air, and decided that blunt honesty would serve best. "I'm afraid I must ask for your help, Nathaniel, and your confidence." Collins's keen eyes flickered with alarm at Edward's grave tone. He gestured to a chair. "Sit, lad. Tell me what troubles you." Edward remained standing, too restless to sit. He drew from his breast pocket Henry's damning letter, folded tightly. "I have discovered a betrayal of the worst sort," His voice nearly cracked, but he steadied it. My wife, Catherine, has been unfaithful. Her lover is Lord Henry Pembroke. The colonel inhaled sharply, eyes widening. Good God. He looked searchingly at Edward, as if hoping this were some jest or mistake. Edward silently extended Henry's letter. Collins took it, adjusting his spectacles with a shaking hand as he read. When he finished, Colonel Collins lowered himself heavily into the chair, as though the letter's weight had sapped his strength. This is dire, he said quietly. Edward, my poor friend. For a moment, neither man spoke. Collins seemed at a loss, his old soldier's mind doubtless recalling similar sordid tales that rarely ended well. Finally, he cleared his throat. Does anyone else know of this? No, and I intend to keep it that way. Edward's tone was steely. But I cannot simply ignore this insult. My honor has been dragged through the mud by the two people I trusted most. Colonel Collins nodded gravely. I understand. What do you propose to do? Edward met his friend's gaze. I intend to challenge Lord Pembroke to a duel. Collins closed his eyes briefly, as if he had expected the answer, but dreaded hearing it aloud. A duel? Edward, you realize what that means. It's illegal. If you're caught, you could be court-martialed or imprisoned, not to mention the risk to your life. Edward's jaw tightened. My life means little to me at this moment. My honor means everything. If I let this pass, I could not look myself in the mirror again. Nor could I continue to coexist in society with that man, knowing what he's done. The colonel rose and placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. I will not try to dissuade you since I see your mind is set. And under these circumstances, he shook his head. In our father's day, no man would fault you for demanding satisfaction. Nowadays, the law and public opinion are against it, but in confidence, many still settle matters at dawn. I knew you'd understand, Edward said quietly. Relief mingled with the adrenaline coursing through him. Will you act as my second? Collins drew a deep breath, then gave a single firm nod. I will. Better me than someone rash who might worsen matters. Now, let us consider the arrangements. They spoke in low, urgent tones for the next quarter hour. It was decided that Colonel Collins would convey Edward's challenge to Lord Pembroke immediately in writing. Edward drafted a terse note on the colonel's stationery. Lord Pembroke, your conduct towards me in violation of my household's honor leave me no choice but to demand satisfaction. I name you for your gross betrayal. My second will inform you of the time and place of meeting. Sir Edward Barrington. Edward sanded and sealed the letter with trembling hands. Every stroke of the pen had felt surreal, yet empowering. Collins summoned his groom and dispatched him on horseback to Pembroke's townhouse with the missive. Now, Collins said, turning to logistics, the location should be as secluded as possible. I suggest the clearing behind the old oak grove on my estate outside Hampstead. It's private land and will have less chance of interference. Edward agreed. Hampstead is far enough from town to avoid early risers stumbling on us, but not so far that traveling there draws notice. I'll arrange a carriage under a false pretense, Collins continued. We should meet at dawn tomorrow. That gives Pembroke enough time to get himself a second and make his peace, if he accepts. He will accept, Edward said coldly. Henry may be a scoundrel, but he's still a former army man. He won't run from this. Even as he spoke, Edward wondered if Henry would try to escape. Perhaps it was partly why he insisted on such short notice. He wanted Henry caught off guard with little time to scheme or slip away. The groom would deliver the challenge within the hour, and by afternoon Edward expected an answer via Henry's own second. There is the matter of weapons, Collins said. Do you prefer pistols or swords? Pistols, Edward replied without hesitation. He had spent years honing his marksmanship and felt confident in it. Besides, a pistol duel would likely be quicker and more decisive. I have a pair of dueling pistols, .50 caliber Mantons in my possession. Collins raised an eyebrow. You keep Mantons? Planning on dueling, were you? A ghost of a wry smile touched his lips, the first hint of levity. Edward managed a grim half-smile in return. They were my father's, passed down to me more as curiosities than anything. I never imagined I would have cause to use them in earnest. Fate has a dark sense of humor, Collins sighed. Bring them, by all means. I'll see to it that powder and shot are prepared. He paused, then said quietly, And Edward, should something go awry, I'll do all I can to protect your reputation, even if the law comes into it. Edward understood the unspoken meaning. If he killed Henry, Collins would help him avoid prosecution by swearing secrecy or helping him flee if it came to that. He clasped Collins's hand firmly. Thank you, Nathaniel. I trust you with my life and honor. They decided Edward should go about his day as normally as possible to avoid arousing Catherine's or anyone's suspicion. They would rendezvous on the edge of Collins's Hampstead estate at 5 o'clock the next morning. Collins would bring a doctor he knew, one discreet and used to such clandestine appointments in case of injury. He would also quietly inform a gravedigger to stand by with a cart in the ghastly event that one of the duelists fell and needed to be carried off secretly. Such preparations were morbid, but necessary. By the time Edward left the colonel's house, London was fully awake. The sun had risen, dull behind layers of cloud. Edward walked home through streets coming to life with delivery carts and hansom cabs, his senses oddly sharpened. The world looked the same, but everything had changed for him. People tipped hats or nodded to him as usual. He returned the gestures mechanically, all the while thinking, if only they knew I may be a killer or a corpse by this time tomorrow. At home, Catherine greeted him in the breakfast room with visible relief. There you are, she said softly. I woke and you were gone. I was concerned. Edward had left early without a word, which was unlike him. He forced an apologetic smile. I'm sorry. I had an unexpected errand to attend to. I thought it better not to wake you. Catherine studied him, and Edward wondered if she detected the strain behind his courteous facade. He felt as though an entire life separate from hers had sprung up overnight, one filled with deadly purpose, of which she remained completely unaware. They sat to breakfast. Catherine picked at her food, clearly still anxious from the previous night's tensions. Edward spoke of trivial matters, the weather, a note from his regiment, but his mind was elsewhere, counting down the hours. Late in the afternoon, as Edward sat alone in his study polishing the walnut case that held his father's dueling pistols, Hawkins brought in a calling card on a silver tray. Sir, a Captain Linton is here to see you. Edward's heart thudded. He did not know Captain Linton personally, but recognized the name as one of Henry's acquaintances. No doubt this was Lord Pembroke's chosen second delivering his reply. Show him in, Edward said. A moment later, a stocky, mustachioed gentleman stepped into the study. Sir Edward, he said with a brisk nod. I am Captain George Linton, here on behalf of Lord Pembroke. Edward inclined his head. Captain, please have a seat. Linton remained standing, clearing his throat awkwardly. Lord Pembroke received your message. He accepts your challenge. The man's eyes darted to the polished pistol case on Edward's desk, then away. He seemed nervous. I must say, Sir Edward, this is most unfortunate. I had hoped to persuade Pembroke to seek some alternative resolution. There is none, Edward interjected sharply, then softened his tone. However, I appreciate your concern, Captain. We all know the stakes. Captain Linton nodded, pursing his lips. Quite. Then I suppose we must proceed. Colonel Collins has already communicated the arrangements to me. Tomorrow at dawn, the oak grove on Collins's estate. Pistols. Edward noticed Linton's subtle exhale, as if the man were holding his breath delivering these details. Thank you for confirming. Will you require the use of our pistols, or does Lord Pembroke have his own? He will bring his own pair, Linton replied. He hesitated, then added quietly, Pembroke asked me to convey that he deeply regrets matters have come to this pass. Edward felt a flash of white-hot anger. Regret? Now he regrets it? He realized his hands had clenched. Taking a breath, he mastered himself and said icily, If Lord Pembroke truly regrets his actions, he will have the opportunity to atone for them tomorrow morning. Captain Linton flushed and looked away. Indeed. He tapped his hat brim. Until tomorrow then, Sir Edward. I shall bid you good day. Edward showed the captain out with minimal words. As he closed the door behind his visitor, he allowed himself one long, shuddering exhale. It was set. Henry had accepted. In less than 24 hours, either Henry or he, or both, could lie bleeding in that quiet grove. Evening fell. Edward avoided Catherine's company as much as he could without arousing suspicion. He claimed fatigue and retired early to the guest room, locking the door behind him. By candlelight, he wrote 2 letters. The first was to his solicitor, a sealed instruction on how to settle his estate and ensure Catherine was provided for, should he not survive the duel. The second was a brief note to Catherine. He struggled with what to say and kept tearing up drafts. In the end, he settled for a few lines. My dear Catherine, if I am gone by the time you read this, know that I loved you deeply despite all. I hope God grants you peace and forgiveness, as I strive to forgive you. E.B. It was not poetry, but it was all he could manage through the bitterness and pain. He sealed that letter as well and placed both missives inside the false bottom of his desk drawer. If he lived, they could be destroyed and never seen. That night, Edward lay in bed fully clothed, the pistol case on the nightstand beside him. His fingers traced the monogram engraved on the case's lid, his father's initials and now his own. How proud his father had been of honor and duty. Edward wondered what the old man would think of him now, about to break the law and risk everything for the sake of wounded honor. Perhaps he would have approved. That generation tolerated much, but not this sort of insult. Edward eventually drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. He dreamed of the Sudanese desert, of battle smoke and bullets whizzing by. Then the dream shifted. He stood in a church at the altar with Catherine in her bridal gown. When he turned to kiss the bride, it was Henry's bloodied face under the veil, grinning skull-like. Edward jolted awake in a cold sweat, heart pounding. Outside, through the gap in the curtains, the night sky was beginning to yield to pre-dawn gray. It was time. He rose, washed his face with icy water, and donned a dark gray suit and a heavy woolen overcoat. He took up the polished pistol case, feeling its weight. Quietly, he slipped from the house, leaving behind a world that would never be the same. Chapter 5. Reckoning at Dawn. The first light of dawn seeped through the fog as Edward arrived at the appointed oak grove in Hampstead. The world was hushed and gray, the grass wet with dew. His breath puffed in front of him as he stepped out of the hired carriage Colonel Collins had arranged. The driver, sworn to discretion, was told only that gentlemen were meeting for target practice. Colonel Collins was already there, along with a portly doctor named Abernathy and the gravedigger with his cart waiting at a discreet distance among the trees. A second carriage stood further down the dirt lane, Lord Pembroke's coach, recognizable by its crest. Edward's heart thumped steadily, a cold calmness settling over him. He felt as if he were back on a battlefield at sunrise, poised before a charge. Only this confrontation was singular and personal. Henry Pembroke stood on the far side of the clearing, talking quietly with Captain Linton. Henry was wrapped in a long, dark overcoat against the chill, his face partially shadowed by a bowler hat. Even from a distance, Edward could see his former friend's features were drawn and pale. At the sound of Edward's footsteps on the damp grass, Henry looked up. Their eyes met across the clearing. Edward felt an almost electric jolt of emotion, anger, betrayal, and a distant echo of the friendship that had once been. Henry opened his mouth as if to speak, but Captain Linton put a restraining hand on his arm and murmured something. Henry fell silent. Colonel Collins stepped forward, taking charge with a grim formality. "Gentlemen, shall we proceed?" Both duelists and their seconds moved to the center of the grove. The ancient oak trees looming around them stood like silent witnesses. A pale pink glow tinted the eastern horizon as the sun prepared to rise behind the clouds. Collins cleared his throat. "Sir Edward and Lord Pembroke, we are here to settle an affair of honor. As seconds, Captain Linton and I have agreed on the terms. The weapons will be pistols. The distance, 10 paces. On my count of 3, you will turn and fire. You may fire sooner at will after turning, but no shot before the count of 3 is completed. Should neither man fall or yield after exchanging one shot, and if honor is deemed satisfied by both, this meeting will end. If not," he paused heavily, "we shall continue with another round." Edward nodded curtly. Henry gave a single nod as well, his lips pressed tightly together. He had not spoken a word. Captain Linton produced Henry's dueling pistols, a handsome pair with ivory handles. Edward opened his own case, revealing the Mantons. He selected one and handed the other to Collins to offer to Henry, so that both pistols used would be from the same set, ensuring fairness. Henry, however, shook his head. "I prefer my own," he said quietly, speaking for the first time. His voice carried across the still air, low and strained. Edward's eyes narrowed. It was customary to use matched pistols in a duel to prevent any advantage. Collins glanced at Edward, who gave a slight nod. "As you wish," Edward replied coldly. If Henry wanted to use his own weapons, so be it. Edward knew his Mantons were accurate. He could not speak for Henry's aim with unfamiliar guns. Perhaps Henry thought his personal pistols luckier or more accustomed to his grip. After a brief consultation, it was agreed each man would use his own pistol for the first shot. Dr. Abernathy stepped forward to examine and load the weapons under the second's supervision. The physician's hands were steady as he poured powder, patched the balls, and rammed them home. During this process, Edward and Henry stood apart, avoiding further eye contact. Edward focused on his breathing, in and out, willing his heart to slow. He felt oddly detached, as if watching from outside himself. His earlier fury had distilled into an icy resolve. Henry Pembroke had to pay for what he'd done. That was all that mattered. At last, Collins and Linton indicated the pistols were ready. Each second handed the weapon to his principal. The hardwood grip of the Manton was familiar to Edward, comforting in its solidity. He checked the priming and cocked the flintlock to half-cock. The seconds led their men to positions on the grassy clearing. Collins paced out 10 paces with long strides, and Linton verified the distance. They marked 2 spots on the ground, using sticks pushed upright into the soil. Edward removed his overcoat despite the chill to free his movement. He stood at his mark in shirt sleeves and waistcoat, pistol at his side. The dawnlight glinted on the polished steel of the barrel. Opposite him, Henry likewise shrugged off his coat and took his place. He held his pistol in one gloved hand. Edward noticed Henry's hand trembling as he lifted it briefly to wipe sweat from his brow, despite the cold morning. A quiet fell over the grove. Somewhere a bird twittered and fell silent. Collins looked between the two duelists. "Gentlemen, are you ready?" Edward's voice was firm. "Ready." Henry responded softly, "Ready." Edward thought he detected a quaver in that single word. "Very well," said Collins. He stood to the side, raising a white handkerchief. "Upon my count of 3, you will turn and fire. 1, 2, 3. On 3, Edward pivoted sharply to his right, raising his arm. In the same heartbeat, he saw Henry turn toward him. For an instant, time seemed to slow. Edward caught a clear glimpse of Henry's face, haunted eyes behind which lay a turmoil of regret or fear, and then Edward's focus tunneled onto his target. He squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the pistol shattered the dawn stillness, a tongue of flame spitting from the muzzle. Almost simultaneously, Henry's pistol discharged with a deafening crack. Edward felt a hot sting graze his left upper arm, but he barely registered it. He was watching Henry. For a second, Henry remained standing, a look of surprise on his face. Then he staggered back one step, his pistol slipping from his fingers. He pressed a hand to his side, where a red bloom was rapidly spreading across his white shirt. A moment later, Lord Henry Pembroke collapsed to his knees on the grass, then crumpled onto his side. "Henry!" Captain Linton cried out, rushing toward his fallen friend. Edward stood rooted, arm still outstretched. Thin smoke curled from his pistol barrel. He slowly lowered it, adrenaline coursing through him. The acrid scent of gunpowder filled the air. Collins hurried to Edward's side. "You're hit!" he exclaimed in an urgent whisper, pointing to Edward's arm. Only then did Edward look down to see a tear in his sleeve and a streak of crimson where Henry's shot had grazed him. "It's nothing," Edward said tersely. Indeed, he felt no pain yet, just a slight warmth and dampness. The ball had merely scored his flesh. Dr. Abernathy was already kneeling by Henry, opening his medical bag. Captain Linton hovered, face ashen. Edward approached slowly, the pistol dangling from his hand. He half expected to feel some triumph at the sight of Henry wounded, punished at last. But as he looked down at the writhing figure of the man who had been his friend, he felt only a hollow sorrow and grim finality. Dr. Abernathy cut away Henry's waistcoat and shirt with practiced motions. The entry wound was on Henry's left side, just above the hip. Edward's bullet had struck low, likely avoiding the heart. Blood welled dark and shiny over Henry's abdomen and into the grass. Henry coughed wetly, his eyes fluttering open to see Edward standing over him. He tried to speak, a bubble of red appearing at the corner of his mouth. Edward knelt down, ignoring Collins's attempt to restrain him. He needed Henry to hear him clearly. "I should kill you now," Edward said in a voice low and cold. "No one would ever fault me for it after what you've done." "But I will not. I have taken my pound of flesh. Let that wound be your reminder of the honor you tried to steal." Henry grimaced in pain, eyes brimming with tears. Whether from agony or remorse, Edward could not tell. Edward, he gasped thickly. I am sorry. So terribly sorry." Edward's throat constricted. This once charming, carefree lord now lay broken at his feet, beyond any earthly redemption. "You will leave England," Edward hissed, leaning close so only Henry could hear. "If I ever see or hear of you again, if you ever attempt to contact Catherine, I will finish what was started today. Do you understand me?" A spasm of pain crossed Henry's face, but he gave a faint, desperate nod. "I understand," he whispered. Dr. Abernathy looked up at Edward urgently. "Sir, we must get him to shelter if he's to survive. He needs surgery to remove the ball." Captain Linton added, "We have a carriage ready to take him to a safe location. He can recuperate in secret." Edward rose, stepping back. His hands were shaking now that the duel was over. Collins gently took the pistol from him and tucked it away. "We should go," Collins murmured. The doctor and Linton were already lifting Henry carefully onto a stretcher the gravedigger had brought from the cart, mercifully not needed for a corpse this day. Henry moaned, barely conscious as they moved him. Edward watched in silence as Henry's limp form was placed into his coach. Captain Linton climbed in beside him, and the doctor mounted the box to ride with the driver. Before shutting the coach door, Linton looked to Edward. "Sir Edward, I will see that Lord Pembroke is sent abroad as soon as he is able to travel. You have my word." Edward gave a curt nod. With a lurch, the coach started down the lane, wheels crunching on gravel. In moments, it vanished into the misty morning, bearing away Henry Pembroke, out of Edward's sight and soon out of his life, perhaps forever. The gravedigger loaded the remaining tools and the blood-stained stretcher onto his cart and trundled off silently, eager to leave the scene. Colonel Collins retrieved Edward's overcoat and helped him don it, covering the tear and blood on his sleeve. "Come, Edward," he said softly. "Let me tend to that scratch and get you home." Edward realized his left arm was beginning to throb, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage Collins wrapped around it. But the physical pain was minor compared to the tempest of emotions swirling inside him. He had won. Honor, by the grim rules of their world, was technically satisfied. His wife's seducer was vanquished and cast out. And yet, as Edward followed Collins to the waiting carriage, he felt no triumph. The cost of this satisfaction was a permanent scar etched not only in flesh, but in the very fabric of his life. Nothing would ever be quite whole again. The sun finally broke above the horizon as Edward's carriage rumbled back toward London. Its rays fell on Edward's face, but he found no warmth in them. He closed his eyes, allowing his head to rest against the seat. There remained one final ordeal ahead: confronting Catherine with the knowledge of what had transpired and making a decision about her fate. In that quiet moment, as the day dawned anew, Edward could not shake the image of Henry's shattered expression, nor the echo of Catherine's laughter in happier times. He knew only that the man returning home this morning was not the same man who had left it. Something had died in the oak grove at dawn, even if both duelists had survived. Chapter 6. Exile Edward stepped through the front door of his townhouse, the morning still young and brightening. He quietly handed his coat and hat to Hawkins, mindful of the bandage concealed beneath his shirt sleeve. A mixture of exhaustion and grim accomplishment weighed on him. It was over. Catherine appeared at the top of the staircase, already dressed for the day in a gray wool morning dress. Upon seeing him, she hurried down, anxiety plain on her face. "Edward, thank heavens. I was so worried. You left before dawn and didn't say anything. Where have you been?" She reached out as if to touch his arm, then froze, noticing a small bloodstain seeping through the white fabric of his shirt sleeve. Her eyes widened in horror. "You're hurt! What happened?" Edward stepped back from her reach, holding up a hand. "I am fine," he said stiffly. "It is a trivial injury." Catherine's gaze darted from the bandage visible at his wrist to his face. She seemed to sense the cold distance in his demeanor. "Edward, your arm. Please, tell me what's going on." Her voice trembled. Hawkins discreetly vanished down the hall, sensing the private nature of the brewing conversation. The house was otherwise quiet. The other servants were occupied in morning chores out of earshot. Edward regarded his wife, her porcelain complexion drained of color, her blue eyes wide with dread, and felt a surge of bitter resolve. He had rehearsed in his mind during the carriage ride how this confrontation would go. But now that the moment was here, the words came slowly, laden with pain. "Catherine," he began, "I know everything." She blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. Everything?" He drew Henry's folded letter from his waistcoat pocket and held it out. "Your affair, with Henry Pembroke." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth as if to stifle a cry. All color drained completely from her cheeks. She stared at the letter in his grasp, but made no move to take it. Her knees seemed to weaken. She swayed and clutched the back of a foyer chair for support. "Oh, God. Edward," she whispered, voice breaking. Edward felt an unwanted stab of pity at her obvious terror. He hardened his tone to keep his resolve. "How long?" he demanded quietly. "How long have you been deceiving me?" Tears spilled from Catherine's eyes. It began over the summer," she choked out. "While you were away. I never meant—" A sob cut off her words. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, mastering the storm of hurt and rage roiling within him. "You never meant," he repeated bitterly. "And yet you did. My own friend, Catherine. In our home, behind my back while I faced death abroad. I'm sorry, Catherine wailed, stepping forward with desperation. I am so sorry. It was a terrible mistake. I was lonely and I foolishly thought I loved him. But it wasn't real. None of it was real. Please, Edward, you must believe me. I regretted it every moment afterward. Edward opened his eyes, fixing her with an icy stare. Regretted it? You continued the affair for months. You wrote him letters, met him in secret. Regret didn't stop you then. Catherine shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. I was weak and lost. Henry said so many flattering things, and I was afraid you'd stopped loving me, that you cared more for your campaigns than for me. But the moment you returned, I realized how horribly I'd erred. That's why I've been so distant. I was guilty and terrified you would find out. Not a day passed that I didn't hate myself for betraying you. Her words tumbled out in a rush, raw and pleading. She tentatively reached for his hand. Edward, my husband, I know I don't deserve it, but if there is any shred of forgiveness in your heart. He pulled his hand away sharply, his voice cold and flat. Forgiveness? You have destroyed our marriage and my trust. Do you comprehend that? Catherine flinched as if struck. She bowed her head, sobbing softly. I do. I know I have ruined everything good in our lives. If I could undo it, I would. I will bear this guilt forever. A silence fell, broken only by Catherine's quiet weeping. Edward realized his own eyes were burning, an ache building in his chest. He had loved this woman deeply. Seeing her brought so low, even by her own doing, caused him agony. But the image of Henry's blood on the grass flashed in his mind, and the corresponding wound in his heart flared anew. He drew a slow breath. Henry Pembroke is gone, he said tonelessly. Catherine looked up, sniffing. Gee, gone? I confronted him at dawn, Edward continued. We met privately. I gave him what he deserved. He did not elaborate on the duel, but his injured arm spoke enough. Catherine's hand flew to her throat. Is he... Did you... She could not finish the question. He lives, Edward answered shortly. I spared his life, but he will leave England and never return. You will never see or hear from him again. A complex emotion passed over Catherine's face. Relief, shock, perhaps a pang of grief. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shuddering. Oh, Edward, what have we done? She whispered. Edward set his jaw. We? No, Catherine. This calamity is of your making and Henry's. I take no blame for it. She dropped her hands, panic flaring in her eyes. What will happen to us? To our marriage? He had pondered that very question endlessly in sleepless hours. Now the answer came with leaden certainty. Our marriage, he said slowly, will remain intact in name only. I will not drag this sordid matter into the public eye. I will not have a scandal ruin the Barrington name or bring further shame upon both our families. But neither will I continue life with you as if nothing happened. Catherine began to cry harder, shaking her head vigorously. Please don't send me away, she begged. I can be a faithful wife to you, I swear it. I will do anything to atone. Just don't cast me off, I beg you. Edward's face remained a mask of resolve. What trust or love could possibly be salvaged between us now? We will keep up a fey aid of civility in public for appearance's sake, but in private, Catherine, there is nothing left. She nearly collapsed to her knees at his feet, clutching at the skirts of his coat. I cannot bear it, she sobbed. I know I've earned your hatred, but please give me a chance. Punish me however you wish. Just don't condemn me to live away from you in disgrace. Edward gently extricated himself from her grasp, stepping back. Seeing her so broken twisted his insides, but he steeled himself. Stand up, Catherine. Have some dignity. With effort, Catherine rose, trembling. He continued, voice low but firm. I will not subject either of us to the pain of a divorce trial. That would only compound the scandal. Instead, you will leave London and return to your father's estate in Kent. We shall tell anyone who asks that you are unwell and need a long rest cure in the countryside. You will stay there indefinitely. Catherine's eyes widened in fresh horror. You're sending me away? How is that different from divorcing me? I'll be as good as dead to society. Would you prefer the alternative? Edward snapped, a flash of anger breaking through. A divorce would make your adultery public. You would be disgraced openly, perhaps even shunned by your own kin. Every newspaper would snicker over the straying wife of Sir Edward. Is that what you want? She shrank back, shaking her head vigorously. No, no, please. He went on more quietly. This way, your reputation can be partially shielded. To the world, you will simply be ill and taking the sea air or some such. In time, perhaps tongues will cease to wag entirely. Meanwhile, I shall continue my duties here alone. Catherine hiccuped through her tears, realizing the finality in his tone. How long must I remain in exile? She whispered. Edward's expression was grim. For as long as I decide, possibly for the rest of our lives. You forfeited any say in the matter when you betrayed me. Catherine covered her face again, sobbing into her palms. Edward let her cry for a minute in silence. His own heart drummed dully in his chest. He felt numb, as though someone else were enacting this miserable scene. At last, in a softer tone, he said, I have written to your father this morning. He will expect you later this week. We will say you have a nervous condition and need quiet. He need not know the truth, unless you choose to tell him. I leave that to you. Through her fingers, Catherine mumbled, Does anyone else know? No, Edward said. And I intend to keep it so. Colonel Collins is aware something transpired, but not the details. The seconds and doctor involved at dawn will hold their peace, under pain of legal repercussions. So long as you and I maintain the fey aid, society will suspect nothing concrete. Catherine lowered her hands, red eyes pleading. Why? Why would you do that for me? After what I've done? He felt a flicker of something almost like dark amusement. This is not for you. It is for the honor of our families and the name I bear. I will not have it dragged through the mud. Consider it a final act of duty as your husband, protecting you from the full consequences of your actions, insofar as public knowledge is concerned. He paused, then added, In private, Catherine, you will have to live with those consequences every day. As will I. She nodded wretchedly. I will. I deserve it. Edward turned away slightly, running a hand over his face. He was bone-weary, the wound on his arm throbbing under its dressing, and the deeper wound in his soul throbbing even more. Pack your things, he said quietly. Take only what you need. I'll have the carriage ready to take you to Kent tomorrow. Catherine approached him one last time, reaching out with trembling hands. Before he could pull back, she gently touched the edge of his bandaged arm. Did Henry do this? She asked brokenly. Edward's jaw clenched. Yes, a scratch. Nothing more. Fresh tears filled her eyes. I can't bear that you were hurt, because of my sin. He gently took her wrists and removed her hands from his arm. The wound will heal, he said, releasing her. It's the scar that remains that I must learn to live with. Catherine looked up at him, and for a moment they stood close, face to face. In her gaze there was a glimmer of the young woman he had fallen in love with years ago, hopeful, kind, full of life. That woman was gone, replaced by one broken by remorse and sorrow. Likewise, the man Catherine had married, open-hearted, trusting, was gone, replaced by a hardened soul barely holding himself together. I wish I could undo it, Catherine whispered. I wish I could go back and remain the wife you deserved. Edward felt moisture prick his own eyes unexpectedly. He steeled himself and gave a single curt shake of his head. Wishes are of no use now. Catherine's face crumpled. I know, she wept. I know. With that, Edward turned and ascended the stairs, leaving her standing in the foyer, clutching herself in misery. That evening, Edward and Catherine dined together with strained politeness, both playing their roles for the sake of the servants who attended. Not a trace of the day's trauma touched their conversation. They spoke of the weather and the condition of the rose garden at the Kent estate. To an outsider, they might have seemed merely concerned about an illness. Only the redness of Catherine's eyes and the pallor of Edward's face hinted that anything was amiss. The following morning, Edward helped Catherine into the waiting carriage. A maid accompanied her to assist during her convalescence. Catherine's father had responded by letter expressing worry for his daughter's health and eagerness to receive her. On the townhouse steps, husband and wife faced each other for what might be the last time in many months, perhaps years. Catherine's gloved hands trembled as she adjusted her traveling cloak. Edward stood stiffly, hands clasped behind his back. She looked at him as if memorizing his face. Thank you for your mercy, she said softly, voice hoarse from weeping through the night. Edward's expression remained distant. I am not doing this out of mercy, he replied. But what's done is done. Take care of your health, Catherine. A faint sob escaped her, but she composed herself. With a deep curtsy, a gesture almost absurd between husband and wife, Catherine turned and entered the carriage. The maid closed the door behind her. Edward signaled the driver. The carriage lurched forward. Through the window, he saw Catherine place a hand to the glass as if reaching for him. Instinctively, he raised his hand in farewell. Then he caught himself and lowered it, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. The carriage rolled down the drive. Catherine's forlorn face vanished behind the curtains as it turned the corner onto the main road. Sir Edward Barrington stood alone on the doorstep of an empty home. He took a long, unsteady breath. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour of 10. Life in London proceeded as normal. The clatter of wheels on cobbles, the calls of street vendors, the faint din of a city alive. But for Edward, nothing felt normal at all. He turned and went inside, shutting the heavy oak door on the bright morning outside. The house was steeped in silence, an empty shell devoid of its mistress. In the foyer, a faint scent of Catherine's perfume still lingered, lavender and lily of the valley. It nearly undid him. Edward squared his shoulders and moved to his study. On his desk lay an invitation to a regimental banquet next week and a letter from a colleague in the War Office. He would attend to them, he told himself. He would carry on. He sank into the leather chair and pressed a hand against his bandaged arm. His mind felt strangely blank at that moment, as if protecting him from the flood of emotions waiting to crash. All he could think was, it is done. Catherine was gone. Henry was gone. Outwardly, his honor was preserved. Yet as Edward sat alone in the quiet of his home, he wondered if honor was a hollow comfort when all that truly mattered had been lost. Chapter 7. The Last Farewell. 6 months passed under the weight of quiet despair. In London, Sir Edward Barrington fulfilled his duties with impeccable form, attending military briefings and society functions alone. Whispers circulated about Lady Catherine's extended illness and convalescence in the country, but no one openly questioned the official story. To the outside world, Edward was the picture of stoic dedication, if perhaps a touch grayer at the temples and more reserved than before. Each night he returned to an empty house. He would sometimes stand at the threshold of Catherine's vacant bedroom, the faint scent of lavender long faded, and feel an ache of loneliness so profound it stole his breath. He tried to bury himself in work. He even briefly took the Sandhurst training post to occupy his time away from home. But nothing could entirely fill the hollow within him. Catherine wrote to him faithfully every week from Kent. Long, earnest letters filled with contrition, recounting the mundane details of her secluded life. Walks in the orchard, helping her mother with charity sewing, prayers said in the village chapel. Edward read each letter in solitude, his chest tight. He seldom replied more than a few cursory lines, if at all. What was there to say? Words between them felt futile to bridge the canyon that yawned between their hearts. As spring turned to summer, Catherine's letters grew more melancholy. She spoke of feeling unwell, though the local doctor found no specific ailment. She confessed to struggling with nightmares and sleeplessness, haunted by guilt and memories of happier times. Her father added a postscript to one letter, gently expressing concern that Catherine's nerves were not improving and suggesting that perhaps a visit from Edward might lift her spirits. It was that gentle prodding, and the worry threaded between the lines of Catherine's own missives that finally moved Edward to act. In truth, she had never once explicitly asked him to come, likely fearing rejection. But in early August, Edward found himself on a train heading down to Kent, heart heavy and uncertain. The summer sun was mellow as he arrived at the sprawling countryside estate of Sir John Harcliffe, Catherine's father. The old manor house stood surrounded by lush gardens and ancient oaks. It was a place that had once been full of fond memories for Edward. Christmas gatherings, summer picnics, the very grounds where he had first courted Catherine under a rose arbor. Stepping out of his carriage now, he felt those memories stir painfully. A footman led Edward through the foyer and out to the rear terrace, where Lady Catherine awaited him in the garden per her request. She had chosen an alcove beneath a large chestnut tree, offering privacy and dappled shade from the afternoon sun. Edward's stride slowed as he approached. Catherine stood at the edge of a stone bench, her back partly turned as she gazed toward a lily pond. She wore a simple, ivory-colored day dress, and a light shawl hung loosely around her shoulders despite the warmth. There was something fragile about her stance. She appeared thinner than he remembered, almost delicate enough for the breeze to topple. Hearing his footsteps on the flagstones, Catherine turned. Edward's breath caught. She was indeed markedly changed. Her face was paler and thinner, the hollows under her eyes pronounced. And yet, when those blue eyes met his, they lit up with an emotion he could only describe as profound gratitude tinged with sorrow. "Edward," she said softly, inclining her head in greeting. Formal, polite, yet her voice trembled just a touch over his name. "Catherine," Edward replied, bowing his head in return. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at one another, unsure how to begin. Gently, Edward gestured to the bench. "Shall we sit?" She managed a faint smile. "Yes, of course." They settled side by side on the stone bench, a respectful space between them. The chestnut tree's leaves rustled overhead, and the fountain in the lily pond burbled softly. For a moment, they watched a pair of dragonflies skimming the water's surface, gathering courage to speak. "It is very good of you to come," Catherine ventured at last, not quite meeting his gaze. "How was your journey?" "Uneventful," Edward said quietly. "The countryside is beautiful this time of year." He glanced at her. How have you been, Catherine?" A sad, rueful smile touched her lips. "As you see," she murmured. "My health has been fickle. Some days are tolerable, others rather less so." She did not detail her struggles, but Edward could infer them from her wan appearance and the tremor in her hands as she folded them in her lap. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely. He realized he meant it. Despite everything, he did not wish ill health upon her. "Perhaps the summer air will restore you." Catherine nodded absently. "Perhaps." Her eyes, drifting over the pond, suddenly brimmed with tears. "Edward, I want to thank you for your letters." He felt a twinge of guilt, knowing how brief his notes had been. But she went on. "Even just the few words you sent meant the world to me. To know you did not entirely forget my existence. It kept me from losing hope on the darkest days." Edward's throat tightened. He had not imagined that his perfunctory replies could hold such weight for her. "I never wished for you to suffer, Catherine," he said softly. Not physically. I'm sorry to hear that you've been unwell. Catherine drew a shaky breath and finally turned to face him directly. Most of my suffering has been of my own making. There is no illness, no pain greater than the remorse I carry. A tear spilled over, rolling down her cheek. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I must say this while I have the chance. She clasped her hands tightly together, knuckles white. I beg your forgiveness, Edward. I have begged for it every day in my prayers, and now I beg it of you in person. Not because I deserve it, I surely do not, but because I cannot bear the thought that you walk this earth hating me for the rest of our lives. Edward felt a lump rise in his throat. He had steeled himself for this moment, telling himself that he would remain composed. Still, hearing her plea in the quiet hush of this familiar garden cut straight to his wounded heart. He looked down at his hands. A light scar was visible on his left forearm, where Henry's pistol ball had grazed him. It had healed to a thin white line, a permanent reminder of that fateful dawn. In so many ways, they both bore invisible scars far deeper. I don't hate you, Catherine, he said, his voice low but clear. She inhaled sharply, as if she had not dared hope to hear those words. Truly. Edward managed a small, sad smile. I won't pretend it's been easy. I was deeply hurt and angry. For a long time, I couldn't think of you without... He broke off, sighing. But hatred? No. That emotion would destroy me as surely as it would punish you. I refuse to live the rest of my life consumed by it. Catherine let out a trembling breath, covering her mouth as more tears spilled. Thank you, she whispered. You have a kinder heart than I deserve. He shook his head slowly. I'm not sure kindness has much to do with it. It is simply the only way forward. The only way... We have both been living in a sort of hell these past months. Hatred would only prolong it. They fell silent, emotions swirling between them. Catherine gently dabbed her tears with a handkerchief. Birds chirped in the hedgerow, oblivious to the human drama unfolding. Finally, Catherine spoke again. Do you think, in time, there could ever be a life for us beyond this separation? Even if only as companions, not as we once were? Edward felt a pang. She sounded so hopeful, yet so afraid of his answer. He looked out at the sunlit garden where butterflies flitted among late summer blooms. I honestly do not know, he said at length. The wound is still there for both of us. Perhaps time will dull the pain, but forgetting. I do not think I can ever forget what happened. Catherine bowed her head. Nor can I, she murmured. Every day I remember and regret. Edward turned toward her, gently lifting her chin with his fingertips, a tentative, almost unconscious gesture of old familiarity. She met his eyes, startled and searching. Perhaps one day, he said slowly, when we are both very old, we will sit together and remember not only the sorrow, but the good years before. Perhaps by then, this will seem like a distant folly of youth, long forgiven. A single hopeful tear traced down Catherine's cheek. I would like that, she said softly, to remember the good years with you. Edward realized his fingers still rested under her chin. He let his hand fall away, a faint flush on his face. It was the first time he had touched her in affection since before the discovery of the affair. Catherine seemed bolstered by his words nonetheless. She reached out hesitantly and laid her hand atop his where it rested on the bench between them. Your forgiveness lifts a great weight from my soul, she said. He did not withdraw his hand from her touch. Her fingers were thin and cool, a reminder of how much she had changed. I forgive you as best I can, Catherine, Edward said quietly. I won't pretend everything can return to what it was. It cannot. But I do forgive you. A sound between a sob and a laugh escaped her lips. She squeezed his hand, then released it respectfully. That is more generosity than I dared hope for. They sat for a while longer, speaking of lighter things. Catherine asked after mutual friends in London, and Edward updated her on small news: the birth of a cousin's child, a promotion he had arranged for one of his subordinates. They navigated these safe topics gently, like people learning to converse anew after a long estrangement. At length, the sun dipped lower, and Edward knew it was time he took his leave to catch the evening train back to the city. Catherine walked him toward the house slowly, her arm tucked loosely in his. It felt natural and yet not, an echo of how they used to stroll together, now tinged with formality. At the front steps, her father and mother appeared to bid Edward farewell and express gratitude for his visit. After a few courteous exchanges with his in-laws, Edward turned to Catherine for parting words. She stood on the bottom step, which brought her almost eye level with him. The golden light of late afternoon softened her delicate features. Edward realized this might be the last time he saw her for many months again. Perhaps longer. "Thank you for coming, Edward," she said softly, so that only he could hear. "You have given me a measure of peace I thought I'd lost forever." He inclined his head. "I only wish we could both find peace in this." She managed a true smile then, small but genuine. "I will pray for it every day." Edward found himself almost smiling in return, a reflex from years past when her smile was contagious. It faded quickly, but the ghost of it remained in his eyes. "Goodbye, Catherine. Take care." "Goodbye," she whispered. In a daring moment, she stepped forward and lightly pressed a kiss to his cheek, an innocent, trembling gesture. When she withdrew, her eyes glistened. "God bless you, Edward." He felt moisture in his own eyes as he gave her a final nod. Then he turned briskly and descended to his waiting carriage. As the carriage rolled away down the long, elm-lined drive, Edward looked back through the window. Catherine remained on the steps, a lone figure watching him depart until distance, and shadows swallowed her shape. The drive out of the estate and through the Kentish lanes was tranquil. Edward leaned back in the seat, closing his eyes. He ought to have felt lighter, having spoken his forgiveness aloud. In a way he did. Some tight knot inside him had loosened. And Catherine, though still sorrowful, would perhaps sleep easier tonight than she had in a long time. Yet a deep sadness clung to Edward as the fields and hedgerows blurred past. He had reclaimed his honor and extended his forgiveness. But in doing so, he finally accepted what he had lost. Trust, once shattered, could not be perfectly mended. Love, once betrayed, could not be fully restored. They were bound to each other still in name and in duty, but the radiant happiness they once shared was a casualty that no duel or apology could ever revive. Edward arrived back in London under a darkening sky. Lamps were being lit along the streets as he stepped down from the carriage in front of his house. He paused before going inside, looking up at the facade of his home. It stood stately and silent, its windows blank and dim. For now, this would be his life, honorable, dutiful, and solitary. He would persevere, as soldiers do after the battle is over and only the aftermath remains. Edward drew a long breath and opened the door. Inside, the halls echoed faintly with his footsteps. He removed his hat and handed it to Hawkins with a polite word, then made his way to the study where papers awaited his attention. There was work to be done, routines to follow, and time to be weathered. As he sat down at his desk, Edward's gaze fell on a framed photograph that he had turned face down months ago, the wedding portrait that had been cracked on the day he discovered Catherine's infidelity. On impulse, he picked it up now. A web of repaired cracks still marred the glass, but behind it, the image showed two smiling young people full of hope and love. Edward traced a finger lightly over the broken glass and the faces beneath. "Honor obliges," he murmured to himself, recalling the creed that had guided him. He had fulfilled what honor demanded, defended his name, delivered justice, and shown mercy. But honor's obligations had cost him dearly, perhaps far more than it was worth. With a faint sigh, Sir Edward set the portrait down again the fractured glass catching the light like a spider's web. Then he reached for his pen and papers, immersing himself in the tasks of the present, carrying within him the weight of the past. And so, in the waning light of day, Edward Barrington continued onward, alone, outwardly unbroken, upheld by honor and duty, yet inwardly forever marked by the twin betrayals and the bittersweet mercy he had chosen to give.